Bum 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 bum.
You're listening to Tov, a podcast about the good place and Jewish ideas. Hi, I'm Jon Spira-Savett with a few words before this conversation with my teacher, Earl Schwartz, about Maimonides and moral development. If this is the first time you're listening to our podcast, this conversation isn't our usual thing. Mostly we have talked about specific episodes of The Good Place and related Jewish teachings to them and laughed. In this episode, we hardly talk about The Good Place at all, so feel free to save it for later and go find one of the other episodes. There's a link in the show notes here to our first podcast about Chapter 1 of The Good Place. I wanted to note as well that this is the first new content we've published here in 2 years. It's September 2025 as I speak. And since our previous episode, much has happened in the world and the country and in the Jewish world, including the October 7th atrocities and the subsequent wars with all their moral consequence. Most days since then, it's been hard to think about comedy as a public response, at least for me, which is part of why it's been a while since I added something to this Tov collection of ours. At the same time, maybe this is a perfect time to revisit a TV show that centers both moral philosophy and laughter. Maybe through The Good Place, some things can pierce through. There is no commentary about current events in the conversation that follows. It's about Rabbi Moses Maimonides and his philosophy and psychology of moral development. Hopefully, the learning in what follows contributes to our own ethical reflection, to repair of the world, tikkun olam, and to our own necessary processes of teshuvah, of returning and realigning ourselves. Thank you for being here. On to our conversation. Hey, this is Jon Spira-Savett, and I am here with Earl Schwartz, who is not just today my conversation partner, but is my teacher. And for those who actually listened to this podcast from its first episode, you may remember or may have heard Earl's name as the teacher that I shouted out as the first person who introduced me to moral philosophy and the study of moral development. Hi, Earl.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for the invitation. I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so this is a chance to talk a bit about work that you have done, and hopefully also particularly to delve into some of the topics in Rambam, in Rabbi Moses Maimonides that have been much referenced in the course of our podcast series. But to start with, Earl, just tell us about where you do your Jewish teaching these days.
These days, John, I have a much more relaxed schedule. I was for many years on the faculty of a local liberal arts college, and I've retired from that position. I still teach on occasion at the St. Paul Talmud Torah through its adult learning program, and at various congregations, including churches, that over the years I've maintained a very precious relationship with around teaching and conversation and the establishment of common ground through common concerns and shared legacy.
I was thinking about the fact that I know that some of your teaching these days also is with your life partner, Nina.
Yes.
And my parents take your courses, are Hasidim of the two of you, and always look forward to that. And one of the things which when I was a student of Earl's, that was also another kind of team teaching that's linked to what you were saying before, when you and Reverend Dave Hawkinson, as a Jewish teacher and a Christian scholar, teaching Jewish kids Bible together, and then eventually teaching Jewish and Christian high school students together, which was such an amazing experience that we had. What led you to begin exploring, well, first of all, maybe moral philosophy generally, and then the work you've done in moral development?
Thank you, John. I could say that in my college years, I was already exposed in quite wonderful ways, to classical Jewish sources dealing directly with moral questions, including sources that perhaps we'll explore in the next few minutes. But that preliminary experience came to fruition in ways that I couldn't have foreseen when my principal at the Talmud Torah of St. Paul invited me in the fall of 1979 to develop a moral education curriculum for the school. Perhaps it would be worth just saying a word about how that happened. There was a teacher workshop at the beginning of that school year, underwritten by a local business person. And at the conclusion of the workshop, the business person who had attended asked everyone to stay seated. And he said, "I appreciate your being here. I want you to know that I had an employee who went to the Talmud Torah of St. Paul and stole from me.
Mm.
I think the Talmud Torah needs to do a better job in the area of ethical education. And if you're willing, I'll pay for that too."
Wow.
So my principal, Rabbi Yossi Gordon, decided he would take the gentleman up on the offer and asked me to work on that curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Do you know why it was you who he asked?
That's a good question. I wonder, John, if it had to do to some extent with the idea that he was set on this curriculum being a cognitive developmental curriculum rooted in the research that was increasingly influential in that area in those years, especially by Lawrence Kohlberg.
Hmm.
And I think Rabbi Gordon thought that my relative proximity to college, I was just out of college a few years as compared to many of the other folks on the faculty, might have exposed me already to the kind of sources that he was interested in pursuing. And he was correct.
Wow, that's so interesting. For anybody who's going to watch this on video, I'm holding up the book that Earl created out of the at least initial stages of that project, in which the discussions that we had on what you called Yom Musar, Ethics Day, which were very memorable for us. And alas, as in many things, it is my sister and not I who is cited in the book, but my sister Ellen, but who deserves all the public recognition too. So I wanted to loop to this work kind of by way of Maimonides, Rambam. And again, on the podcast, I really talked about one of my kind of origin stories for exploring the good place is the sense that there's an uncanny set of parallels between or even applications between what happens on this TV show and the teachings of Rambam about teshuvah, this notion of kind of personal change or self-realignment through return. And again, I'm quite sure that this is in some degree, I don't think this is intentional. Let's say there's nothing I've ever read that the creators of the show were scholars of Rambam, but anyway, here it is. We still hope to talk to them and maybe find out if they've if there's more to it. But anyway, do you want to say anything about Maimonides and who he was and where and when he lived and what were key factors of his life?
Yes, and I would start that, John, by simply noting that in a moment, it's my pleasure to suggest that there was a remarkable affinity between that cognitive developmental approach to moral learning and what I had already learned about Rambam's understanding of human development. That is cited in the book that you showed a moment ago, and I think says something very important about Rambam's vision and a characteristic of Jewish life more broadly that perhaps Rambam was tapping into in a distinctly Maimonidean sort of way.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to say, so is there anything that you think is kind of the key, what you have to know about Rambam in order to then enter that
Yes,
description that you're going to give us? Yeah.
I would say regarding his personal story, having been born into a relatively comfortable sector of Andalusian Jewry, in the first third to or so of the 12th century, there's a little bit of disagreement about exactly what his birth date was. Conventionally 1135, it could have been a little later. His father, a prominent member of that community. As a young adult, his birth family fled Andalus for Morocco when southern Spain was overtaken by the Almohadin movement, which understood itself to be a kind of back to basics Islamic essentialist movement that had very little room for broader toleration of other religious communities. Maimonides' family thought, let's get out while the getting is good. I will, I think, a little later in our conversation, say a word about the possibility that in order to stay safe, Maimonides' family, Maimonides personally, lived publicly as Muslims
Mm.
and pursued a secret Jewish life, which he was able to recover when eventually he and his family crossed the Mediterranean, initially to Israel, and then finally to Egypt, where he rose in prominence in the Jewish community and civil society more generally, but carried with him ever after, perhaps, especially as it relates to our conversation about teshuvah, the memory of having lived a foundational lie,
Hmm.
is to say, I am not the man in private who I appear to be in public.
Mm. Mm.
To some degree, it's worth exploring the extent to which that part of his biography can shed some light on what he later comes to say about a wide variety of issues, including questions of teshuvah, of return, of
Mm.
reconstruction, and enhancement of one's personhood.
Mm. Wow. Do you want to say something about just a brief bit about the major works that Rambam is known for?
Yes, yes. He apparently was writing relatively early in life, in his early 20s, perhaps. His first major work, his commentary on the Mishnah, was begun, it appears, also while still in his early to mid 20s. I want to refer back to that commentary a little later. In midlife, he composed what was at the time perceived as a highly controversial halachic code.
A code of Jewish law. Yeah.
Yes, a code which seemed to violate the principle that the transmission of Jewish normative practice needed to be from teacher to student, judge to community member, directly and orally. That standard had been set by Talmud, and that to compose a written code violated that foundational characteristic of rabbinic tradition. Nevertheless, for a variety of historical reasons, his halachic code, his code of Jewish law and normative practice, would become eventually quite influential. And it too included philosophical pieces as well. Mm. Late in life, he composed what is perhaps his most highly regarded work, his Guide of the Perplexed, in which he explores foundational truths which he will insist are implicit, but perhaps not explicitly stated in classical Jewish sources, beginning with biblical sources. And in between, along the way, he issued several public papers on pressing issues of the day regarding Jews and Jewish life.
So one just follow-up question to what you said about the oral law. Obviously, there were, the Talmud itself had been written down, and there were things that were. But are you saying that the idea that the text that a text like this could sort of sit with the individual Jew themselves rather than be in a partnership with the teacher and the student, is that what you're saying was the change?
Yes. Yeah. And that the phenomenon of meeting the teacher over the words of tradition was an entirely different dynamic than looking up an answer in a book. Mm.
So I thought maybe we could enter Rambam's thought through this idea of teshuvah. And, I certainly remember, myself and like probably a lot of people who initially learned his teachings about teshuvah, we learned them around actually the time of year we're having this conversation and recording this, which is in the lead up to the Jewish New Year, the High Holy Days, to Rosh Hashanah, in the month of Elul on the Jewish calendar, and thought of teshuvah as one of the practices particularly associated with the New Year. But in Rambam, even in the Code of Law, his teachings about teshuvah are really not in the holiday section. They're in the kind of fundamentals section, and then it seems to me, and again, I'm talking as the somewhat learned, but not nearly as much as my teacher here. It seemed to me that there's kind of a moral psychology right there in the beginning, both in this notion that this is a foundational practice and that this is somehow that he teaches something kind of related to how people experience themselves as an actor in the world, and also how he talks about free will in that context. And so, his classic teaching about that complete teshuvah gemura, is when you arrive at a situation and you're kind of aware of your own psychology when you did that wrong thing the first time, and you choose, or I guess as an act, what we probably later in philosophy would call, by an act of will, or by whether through your will, rather than through. And he makes a point of saying that it's better than just being aware of the cues around you or the forces around you that might also lead you to do a better thing. And so does that track as a description of kind of his? So is that part of a broader? Is it part of a broader philosophy, a broader psychology? How do you see that?
Yes, thank you, John. I would start by saying that it's been noted that in dealing with the question of moral integrity, damaged, restored, and developed, one of the initial striking characteristics of Maimonides' approach is that it's unmistakably psychological. That is to say, he begins in texts dealing with this question with observations about the nature of the human psyche. In his 8 chapters in particular, this is quite a prominent characteristic.
The 8 chapters were part of the commentary on the Mishnah, or were separate?
Right. The introduction to his comments on the part of Mishnah known as Avot, or conventionally in English as Ethics of the Fathers. By beginning his treatment of the issue not with what might be seen as more conventional religious categories, but an exploration of the nature of the human psyche, he clearly is framing where he's going in terms that are best understood as rooted not in classical Jewish sources per se, but in Greek philosophical texts, especially Aristotle. Having said that, however, there is this peculiar developmental arc that emerges in most of his treatment of the questions that we're exploring, twice in the Mishnah commentary, twice in his Guide of the Perplexed, that suggests a far more complex vision of the nature of human cognition than might be attributed to Aristotle himself. That is to say, on the one hand, Maimonides is interested in exploring what human judgment is like at any given moment, while simultaneously saying it's inherent in the human being to have the potential for that dynamic to grow, to expand, to mature, and that process is itself providential. Having said that, John, I would just summarize this point by noting that his stages repeatedly of human maturation are strikingly similar to 20th century cognitive developmental theorists such as Jean Piaget, Lawrence Kohlberg, and others. Maimonides begins by saying young children are primarily concerned with concrete phenomena, immediate relationships, and the consequences of one's actions in the most physical terms. He says, over time, we develop the potential to think more socially and to come to value our place in larger, more abstract social systems, which allot roles and reward through relative prominence and position socially. And then he says, but ultimately, human maturation can be fully realized only through intellect. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but I just want to say, John, that given this initial dynamic that you rightly noted has to do with taking choice or decision or will seriously, and this broader developmental arc that we can potentially move through stages in life that bring us closer and closer to what a human being is ultimately intended to realize. Having said that, teshuvah, self-judgment, remorse, and reconstructing our lives in ways in light of our engagement with where we've gone wrong would also seem to be on a developmental arc as well. That is to say, if a young child is primarily preoccupied with the immediate concrete consequences of one's actions, it would stand to reason that a young child's sense of making good of what one has done wrong would also be contextualized in terms of how do I recover those positive, immediate, concrete relationships and assets. And that it would stand to reason that self-judgment, a sense of repentance and teshuvah would next, later in one's life, perhaps take on social consequences. The way in which I recover who I am has to do with listening more carefully to the way in which larger society has expectations of me and responsibilities that I may have failed but can now recover. But that once again, tshuva in Maimonides' calculation would ultimately have to do with a way of realizing ultimate truth in a purely cognitive sense.
So does this mean that is there sort of a switch point where a person in Maimonides' view kind of, I'll say this crudely, like takes control of their body or takes control of their brain, which is a physical thing. And I know that he talks in the language of medieval science about the whatever the humors or the the things in us, and talks about the predispositions that a person's tendency to be angry or to be more patient, which have certainly moral dimensions, are also kind of what we would say kind of wired into us. And is there sort of is it just a continuum, or is there sort of a point at which that flips into this pure, is that an intellectual state, an emotional state?
I would start by saying, John, that he presumes that that final stage of human self-realization is extraordinarily rare. Let me just note that whereas 20th century developmental psychologists tended to be strongly influenced by liberal democratic principles and a broad experience of common ground in society for all members having to do with social responsibilities and common rights, Maimonides never experienced such a society. His assumption, which he states repeatedly in any number of ways, is that the vast majority of his fellow Jews, let alone human beings in general, will spend their whole lives thinking and reasoning more or less the same way they did as children. That some will come to mature beyond that stage to a greater social awareness. But very few, an extremely minute, small number of people ever fully realize what it means to be human. And the other side of that coin is that those less mature ways of reasoning, Maimonides says, means that you will never be able to extricate yourself from all of the natural causations that you will come to see as fate, destiny, or providence. The only way to escape that world is to reach the point where you are completely free of the material. And the only way to do that is through thinking. And very few human beings will ever reach that stage. And then one more thing about that, which is, he says in any number of locations I can't afford to tell this to the public at large, that to say, you know, you could grow up, but you probably won't, would not only be demoralizing, but it could very likely prove demoralizing. And so, once again, we're faced with a man who was quite honest about his need not to be honest, at least not to be fully honest with his public, lest saying what he ultimately thought human beings could be, but almost no human beings would be, would prove counterproductive.
Do you think that this is because this is an assessment of human nature or an assessment of his world that he was in and its possibilities?
I would like to believe, John, that given his vision, it's the latter, that he never saw an environment that seemed to yield the kind of results that a classic liberal democratic perspective would say we must aspire to in practical ways. However, I would note that his messianic vision seems to be essentially a vision of a world in which those conditions do ultimately prevail, that allow for mass maturation. He never saw it. He seems to be ambivalent about whether we will ever see such a world. But in his more optimistic moments, perhaps, realized that a sense of Jewish integrity requires, including in one's worldview, the possibility of a world that allows the human being to become fully human. It's not magic. It's not miraculous. It's not messianic in any apocalyptic sort of way. It's just the kind of conditions that might allow this to happen.
You know, I think about a couple of things related to the picture you're describing. When I look at Hilchot Teshuvah, the chapters that he talks about Teshuvah in the code, they seem to kind of begin conceptually. They go to Teshuvah as a practice,
Yes.
and then go to very much the mechanics of interpersonal reconciliation and forgiveness. And then I think, if I'm thinking right, go out to this question of free will that he talks a lot about, and that this is the work that was most directed toward the widest kind of audience. And I think it's in the Shmona Prakim, in the 8 chapters, that he deals with the question of, like, is it better to be a tzaddik, I guess, to be someone whose soul is not struggling with these questions, or is it better to be someone who is succeeding in the process of overcoming their kind of human nature, which seem like they're very pragmatic questions that are widely applicable. I mean, are those being spoken to a wider audience than the narrow that you described?
I would say, John, in that regard, that if we're looking for contrasting perspectives in Jewish tradition more broadly, I would cite, for first of all, classical Hasidism and the Hasidic dictum, for example, there's nothing as whole as a broken heart. That kind of Hasidic emphasis on a kind of existential, radical engagement is a world removed from Maimonides.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, I would cite Buber. If Martin Buber's perspective is that a human being only realizes their I in meeting you, Maimonides would say a human being can only dissolve their I by meeting the truth.
Mm.
But to some degree, the I is problematic, and that the truth relieves us of that I-ness.
Mm.
I say this by way of suggesting that Maimonides' understanding of human integrity led him to conclude that deep personal struggle was in and of itself not an essential characteristic
Mm.
of moral advancement.
Mm.
That among the Hasidic masters, there was no other way, that struggle was to be embraced, that the broken heart was a step forward. You don't find that in Maimonides. And in the text that you cited, John, the idea is floated that the struggle to suppress one's counterproductive qualities is no indication of integrity. It
Mm.
might be necessary, but it's not preferable.
You said that. Oh, yeah. Go on.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, please.
No, you said before that that Maimonides has a developmental perspective.
Yes,
So how does that fit? What's you said developmental, but not necessarily valuing
yes.
struggle or
In
pitfalls. Yeah.
in his um, various examples of a developmental taxonomy, and I said there are at least 4 detailed such texts in his work, it looks like he intends essentially to be describing something that is a convergence of maturation and learning. It seems that when he's cognitive, he means cognitive, other than personal crisis as a learning experience per se. It doesn't look like he emphasizes that aspect of human experience as potentially educating.
With the when you say when you're saying maturation, I think you're saying in the technical professional sense in psychology that's the kind of inner the unfolding of how development occurs, not through our efforts or
Yeah.
learning is the whatever somehow directing, whether ourselves or through teaching. Maturation is a inner naturally unfolding process. Is that what you mean?
And that it converges in Maimonides' work with what appears to be essentially educational cognitive experience. In other developmentalists, you do find a much greater emphasis on moral learning can be spurred through experiential dilemmas. They don't simply have to be stories that your teachers tell you.
Mm. So when you
Maimonides,
yeah
Maimonides doesn't seem to move in that direction as far as I'm familiar with his work.
So does that mean thinking means that you reach the extent to which you've perceived an idea, you see either what you think is a limitation or a contradiction, and that's the spur. It's a dialectical, but also with the maturation, your mind has to be able to reach to a new. So it's a process of purely intellectual development from one idea to the next. Is that?
Yes. And that it ultimately has the potential to free one from circumstance, because truth is the only dimension of the reality we share, which is not subject to circumstance. Truth simply is. So to the extent that we engage truth, we participate in that is, which frees us from all of the limitations of the circumstances that we tend to focus on in life.
I have before I get to sort of a question about where that picture also intersects with some of Maimonides' teachings about kind of weighing of deeds. Well, actually, since I mentioned it, let me start there and then go to the other thing. The thing which probably I think Maimonides may be most noted for in teaching about teshuvah, or probably his biggest quote that's often quoted, is this metaphor that that a person should generally see themselves as equally balanced between merits and wrongs, and that balance is consequential for yourself, and how your destiny will be weighed, I suppose, when you die, and but also that you're the one whose next act will tip the balance for the world and its judgment. And that's, I'm wondering if that is, and I would have said, well, it's easy to dismiss that as kind of a metaphor, or an imagining, which might even be unusual for someone like Maimonides, who maybe isn't given to, or might think that kind of imagining is dangerous. But following on that, in his code are some things where he talks about how you know whether a deed should count on the scale, like if you repeat it several times, or can you sort of negate it by other things. And does he also have an idea that there's that we can sort of sum our actions, and that's an ethical measure of ourselves?
I think, John, I would characterize it in terms of Maimonides' understanding the mitzvah system broadly, with a few exceptions, as a therapeutic system. A system designed to shape and stimulate healthy psychological responses, and that the nature of Jewish life is geared toward a constant, repetitive adjustment of judgment and perspective. And that in that regard, one could productively approach any given mitzvah as a movement towards something which will somehow move me closer to the golden mean, which circumstance tends to push me away from. But that's how mitzvot work. That God's ultimate intention in commanding, as it were, is to shape our character. Our character is intended to stimulate our judgment. And in that regard, seeing each approaching decision as the opportunity to come somewhere toward balance again is a productive way to approach a therapeutic system.
When this may be a question about ethical philosophy generally and not Maimonides. I think about it in terms of Kant, but it may be where this meets the Maimonides and meets Aristotle, is that the referent for all of this is still, people, real people, and people embedded in groups or society. In order to, the mitzvot themselves, or ethical, ethics is about ourselves with other people, and ethical truths are about us vis-a-vis other people. and then what you're describing, the therapeutic is about at the very least, the relationship between our mind and our whole package of body and mind. How can you then abstract truth out of that? Isn't ethics really isn't real people made real in real societies what this is all about? Yeah.
That this is all preliminary, preparatory, and then you need the teacher who catalyzes that readiness intellectually. But if that teacher is missing, one can stand ready and yet unfulfilled.
I guess my question was that is there value to Maimonides in ethical behavior, because the mitzvot are much of them about ethical behavior, and that behavior is good. It is good. It is good for you, but also it's good in the world. Does that? Yeah.
I would allow me, John, the chutzpah, to frame it in this way. In a letter to a colleague, Maimonides says famously, "I spend my day at the court as a court physician, for which I receive compensation. However, on the way home, I go into the city and treat the common folk. And that wastes the rest of the time that I could have used to study." I want to believe that what we hear there is a man who had minimal experience living on common ground with common folk, but came from a tradition that said you must remain faithful to the community as a whole. And so what we hear is a man who doesn't quite embrace that common ground, but cannot walk away from the suffering poor. And I'd like to believe that if he had lived at a different time and a different place, everything that we've said about his perspective on human judgment would have allowed him to grow in that direction as well. But he was very much a person of his time and place.
You said that his experience of exile and his experience of living in that world may have shaped his articulation of the concept of teshuvah. You suggested you might come back to that as a frame. Say more about that.
Well, regarding the likelihood that he and his birth family lived this life of secret Jew, public Muslim, meant that ever after he would have to understand what it meant to come back to a full Jewish life, having been apparently unwilling in some people's eyes to sacrifice all for the sake of living publicly as a Jew. He needed to find a way to explain to himself and to others that that can be redeemed. And the way he does it, to a great extent, in his Igeret Hashmad, his specific writings about this issue, which he likely wrote at a very young age is to say, well, if you can run away from such a place and don't, that's inexcusable,
Hmm.
which justifies his family's behavior because eventually they do.
Hmm.
He also, I think, is comfortable distinguishing between living a life that causes one to apparently violate any number of what he or we might refer to as relatively minor mitzvot, if it doesn't ultimately contradict one's adherence to fundamental principles. And in Maimonides' case, he apparently was comfortable with the idea Islam affirms at its core principles that I have no need to deny.
Hmm.
My reconstruction of my Jewish life doesn't require that I pull the rug completely out from under how my family managed to survive under those circumstances. It just requires a return to Jewish convention.
I heard recently a talk by Rabbi Shai Held in which he referred to Maimonides as I forget exactly his words, as Aristotle's like most faithful child.
Mhm.
And it seems I'm intrigued by how much of again, as not a scholar of any of these things myself, but how much of Aristotle's picture of ethical cultivation there is that's being translated in some cases very directly by Rambam. But for Aristotle, it seems like he, that he had more of a social vision, I guess, that what he was doing was in support of a picture of the perfection of his society than you're saying that Maimonides had. And I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
rather than Aristotle, I would say it's hard to imagine Maimonides in Socrates' shoes.
Hmm.
That this was not the kind of fellow who gave any indication of standing in the town square and engaging folks in conversation about fundamental questions. Quite the contrary. He was extremely cautious about precisely those potential conversations for the reasons we've suggested. His belief that prematurely introducing ultimate truths in communities unprepared for them was counterproductive.
Hmm. I want to make a bit of a bridge to the other to your work and the developmental cognitive moral picture and also, I guess note along the way that it's not my purpose here to say that everything that Maimonides said is for us and exactly the way he experienced it. And one of the things I think that comes obviously with being a teacher or a writer that has influence is that your things end up in other people's hands. Aristotle's work ended up in Maimonides' hands. Maimonides ended up in everywhere, Spinoza and us, and we have democratized it, ourselves.
Say in that regard, John,
Yeah.
may have been no accident that Socrates never wrote
Hmm.
a book about himself.
Hmm.
It took a Plato to semi-fictionalize his teacher.
Yeah.
That may have been no accident.
Hmm.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I think about there are pieces of Maimonides that have, as I say, I have as I see there again. If you're watching this on video with my pastelly good place themed things, and of course the laughs that over a period of discussion of this podcast we have linked to teaching of Maimonides. I don't imagine Maimonides as a guy who laughed, a ton. And but anyway, but that's a here we're just kind of exploring him in his own right, in his own world. But you had said that some of what he did was to at least anticipate at least a kind of an educational theory, at least for a person who could travel this path. And I'm curious more about that. I do remember, and I was perusing your introduction again earlier today, that one of the struggles even in the modern theorists was the sense that if you that even for someone with a built on a more democratic picture of who moral perfection or development was available for, still, Kohlberg ended up with, at least for a time, this picture that a person would in some sense surmount or surpass the allegiance to the particular. They might be they might have allegiance to the highest principles of their society, but have to stand apart from it because of ethical development. And so I'm curious, just anything you want to say about the picture that you've worked on educationally in this, and whether that relates to Maimonides or not.
What
That was about 6 questions right in there. So
I appreciate the question, John. I think I would say that I'm grateful for having been exposed the way I have been to the possibility that there is something about being human that takes time to be fully realized, and that community is responsible for making sure that time is available. And in Jewish history, that has taken 2 forms. The first is the school as a primary Jewish institution. The message, we can learn our way to something of ultimate significance, which is Maimonidean at its core, as we've said. And perhaps the other side of that coin is that communities are responsible as well for providing the time and the space to get it wrong and then to get it right. That living communities must provide the opportunity, not simply for getting it right all the time, but for getting it right some of the time and having the opportunity to put it together again. And in that respect, I think we are somewhere within the Maimonides perspective as well. One would have hoped that in speaking about community, he could have envisioned a more vital and dynamic way in which community could, in fact, cultivate that time and space for everyone of every gender, everyone of every class. But I think somewhere within his consciousness, there lurked the recognition we came from nowhere and nobodies. And our sacred tradition somehow has said, you must never forget how far you've come. And that's providence. But it takes time. That God's grace is, to a great extent, realized over time.
Do you want to say anything more just about the Kohlberg related work, or either did that come to a any sort of enduring understandings for you, or is it something that still operates in your even in the teaching that you're doing now with adults?
Maybe if I could, John, if I could tell a very brief story about Larry Kohlberg himself
Of
that I think,
course. Yeah.
that I think relates to the questions we've been exploring today. Larry Kohlberg came from a relatively prosperous, comfortable background, and he graduated high school in the spring of 1945. And he had the intention of getting away from all of that privilege by joining in the fight against fascism. But the war ended too soon.
Mm.
And so, because there was an armistice in Europe, he joined the Merchant Marine, sailed to Europe, and came across Jewish displaced persons camps. He was deeply moved. Larry's father was Jewish, and he immediately felt, I think, a visceral connection, and joined the Jewish underground, smuggling refugees into British Mandate Palestine. He tells the story. The first thing he ever published was called Beds for Bananas, the Nora Journal, about a boat that was supposedly transporting bananas, but was actually transporting secretly Jewish refugees. His skill, gathered in the Merchant Marine, made him quite valuable as a crew member of the boat. He said, as his boat approached the Palestine shoreline, it was boarded by British soldiers. There was a melee on deck. There was casualty. It was chaos. And Larry said years later, I stood there and thought, how is it possible that those British soldiers and we Jewish refugees and sailors have the same information but have come to such different conclusions about what's right? He said, my research on moral development began with that moment. And I think it's valuable in this regard, John. I think if we're a little troubled by the intellectual nature of Maimonides' approach to human self-realization and ethics in particular, it's worth considering that Kohlberg's research began with, we've got the same information, but maybe that's not what thinking is all about. There's more to thinking than knowing. And one would hope that Maimonides shared that cognitive developmental insight as well.
Is there anything in this universe of things we've talked about that you think is important to add right now?
I would just say that when I study Maimonides, I appreciate his challenge. That this was a person who was quite eccentric in some regards, was cautious about being too open about that. But I appreciate that we come from a tradition in which this was an individual who, despite the kinds of attitudes we've described today, nevertheless felt bound to a real community in real time. It may aggravated him. It may have alienated him at times. He may have said, I could be reading a good book, but I've got to treat these poor patients. And that got to, that says a whole lot about the man.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will offer to you as an incentive to dive at some point into this television show that at least if you don't know the ending of it, the beginning is this small group of people. It's a kind of Gilligan's Island setup who they really it's their own destinies that for each of them are what's at stake. And the show kind of explores what for each of them their teshuvah would need to be. And through that it's sort of there's its own kind of dialectical process, I think, where that becomes attached to the I think in the most brilliant thing in The Good Place, it is about where they discover that perhaps their destiny or what they have to apply themselves to is detached from motivation about themselves to saving other people into eternity. And the show gets a glimpse at the end to what it would mean to turn what they have learned in their small microcosm into a system that could ultimately contribute to the world, while also imagining what it is that it means to live in the phases of life here on Earth in our bodies, and some kind of evolution of that beyond, and perhaps some other evolution beyond that. So it's actually been a little while since I watched The Good Place, and as I'm talking about it, it's making me think that that's another thing to go back to in this phase. But I want to thank you, Earl, so much for taking time to talk to me and to teach us about Rambam and Maimonides' psychology and philosophy. And so this is decades that you've been my teacher. So thank you. And I might ask you, as I've asked most people here, if there is any kind of other, you have mentioned a little bit about the past, but is there any other teacher you want to also give a shout out to of your own from maybe part of your origin?
Oh, I so appreciate that, John.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, oh, what a wonderful opportunity. Without necessarily focusing on individuals, I would say that I have ever been grateful for the fact that when I reached my middle school years, I was attending a school in the toughest neighborhood in Minneapolis that was the recipient of the very first War on Poverty funds allocated in the country. So early that the Model City program in my neighborhood was called Pilot City. And my middle school brought back teachers who saw the moment as an opportunity to teach toward something better. And their teaching, Anna K. Schwartz, Jack Moskowitz, Ronnie Heiligman, their teaching was infused with the message, learning can be a key to the world we're reaching for. In that respect, they'd appreciate Maimonides' perspective as well. I would like to think that perhaps at some point he came home after one of those days in the poor neighborhood of Fostat after seeing patients and said to somebody in his household, today I learned a lesson I could only learn because I had the opportunity to meet that person. Halavai.
Halavai. Yes, would that be so? Well, again, thank you, Earl, and I'm wishing you now, as we're talking, and anybody who's going to listen to this at this particular time we release it, or at an annual point in the calendar around this time of year, a Shana Tova, a good new year, Shana Tova Umetuka, a good and sweet one, which we all need.
To you as well, John, to the family, and to all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's all for this episode of Tove. If you've liked the podcast, tell other people about it, share a link, or give us a good rating. You can subscribe on your favorite app or follow on YouTube, or bookmark our website, tovegoodplace.com, where we have show notes too, including further learning about Maimonides and links to teaching from Earl. You can also keep up with the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Tove Goodplace. Thank you again to Earl Schwartz for talking with me. If you're in the Twin Cities, you can watch for opportunities to learn with Earl, especially through the Talmud Torah of St. Paul, and also through area synagogues and churches, as Earl mentioned. I'm Jon Spira-Savett, and you can find me through my website, rabbijon.net, that's Jon, or on social media at RabbiJS3. If you have thoughts sparked by this episode you want to share, or any questions or feedback or ideas related to the podcast or any of its themes, email me, tove@tovegoodplace.com. If you're listening to this as it's being released, then we are leading into the new Jewish year and the holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I want to wish you a Shana Tova Umetuka, a good and sweet new year. If you're looking for connections at this time of year to a Jewish community or learning or services where you live or online, drop me a note. And if you're in or near New Hampshire, come and we'd love to have you at our synagogue, Beth Abraham in Nashua. Once again, thank you for listening and making time for Tove. And to put a twist on the words of Mark Evan Jackson, who plays Sean and hosts the official Good Place podcast, now go learn more about something good.
Bum 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 bum. Bum 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 bum.